Today, I've been asked to help you kind of cope with the wildlife that lives among us. And I'm going to do it kind of this way. Number one, I'm going to explain to you why they're here. And you say, well, I don't really need to know why. But you do need to know why, because that helps us with the rest of the equation. We can't deal with it unless we know the why. Okay, so like I said, keep in mind that phrase, they like what you like. So they're here for the habitat. You need these four things: food, water, shelter, and space. Wildlife needs those four things. So, coyote. Let's talk about these a little bit. Now, some of you will immediately recognize there's a difference between these two, other than the fact that they resemble each other. They both have four legs. On the bottom of the legs, they have a paw. They have a bushy tail. They have a long snout. They have ears that stick up. But one is a pet dog, a German Shepherd, and the other one is a coyote. Now, this picture is a little deceiving because they're not anywhere close to the same size. And we're going to talk about the size of coyotes in a minute, but they're a lot smaller than they appear to be. Here are some of the common concerns that we hear. There's a coyote running through the desert, and then there's a pause. And I say, well, okay. Well, what are you going to do about it? Nothing. Well, who's going to feed it? Mom Nature does a good job of that. Everything they need is out there. Well, who's going to give it water? They do just fine, because that's the way nature works. But we have to realize that for some people, that care is very real to them. And so when we talk to them, we try to teach them, we have to keep that in mind. I saw a coyote walking through my neighborhood. I think it's lost. Can someone come and help it find its way back? Well, no, it knows where it's at. It's just checking things out because they like what we like. I always hear a large group of coyotes howling nearby. I heard they howl after they made a kill. You and I talk and chat all the time. It doesn't mean we killed something. They have different ways of using calls. I'll talk about it a little bit more in a minute, but that's how they communicate. Is there a stranger in our midst? And I'll talk about that because that's critical down the road. Where are you? Those kind of things. And they have this unique ability, they call it a bow jest. There's another name for it. I'll get to it. It's in my slides, so it can help me. I'm having an AARP moment. And it allows them to sound like there are multiple animals when there's only one. Because it's like having four teenagers talk all at one time, and you wonder, how on earth? But that's what that is, and we'll talk about that. Will the coyote eat my cat? You bet. You bet. And we're going to talk about how you can deter that. Let's talk about the coyote. Coyotes are native to the Mojave Desert. They've always been here. They're like cockroaches. They're always going to be here. They adjust their reproduction schedule based on available habitat, meaning on a normal basis, and we'll talk about this some more later, but on a normal basis, they breed once a year. But if there's enough vacancy in the habitat, they'll have another round. So they'll reproduce twice in a year. So keep that in mind when we start talking about the concept of relocation. They can be found literally coast to coast. California to New York, Mexico to Canada and beyond. Every major metropolitan city has coyote populations. Salt Lake, Phoenix, Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, New York, Chicago, St. Louis. All of them have coyote populations, and people are amazed to find out that they actually are existing where they've been living for 20 years and they just moved from and never saw one. But they're there. They're a very... You guys, I can say this, and you guys will all remember Wile E. Coyote on Saturday morning cartoons. See, I tried this at a younger group, and they looked at me. What are you talking about? So it didn't work. But they don't call him Wile E. Coyote for nothing. They're unprotected. They're considered a varmint, which means in Nevada, they are like a mouse or a rat. They fall in the same category. There's no protection for them whatsoever. They can be hunted 24 hours a day, 365 days a year in most parts of the state, not in city, of course. They are trapped. And what does that mean? That means that you can hire a pest control company to come in and remove them. That's what that means. There's no protection on them, none of that. And so just for background, coyote, the adult weighs only about 20 to 25 pounds. I often have people call my office and say, "This is the biggest coyote I've ever seen. It's as big as a wolf." I says, we don't have coyotes that are big as a wolf here. They only get, oh yes they do, I saw it. And so we have the conversation and we try to help them out, but really they're only about 22 to 25 pounds, about 2 feet tall at the shoulder. They'd be anywhere from tan and brown with gray streaks to some parts of Nevada they actually have a red hue. Not real strong red like a red fox, but they have a red tint to their fur. You'll see those especially up north around Ely and beyond. They generally breed January through March and live about 6 to 8 years. Now, I've got to qualify this generally because in the southern climates, animals do things a little different than they do in the northern climates. In the northern climates, they're pretty much on a set schedule because of the heavy winters that we have. Well, we haven't had a real winter in southern Nevada for probably 20 years. And so these animals, where it's so mild, will actually breed twice a year in some cases. Or not twice a year, but later in the year. So outside of that January, March thing. They'll den up in rock crevices, sinkholes, underbrush. People that live up on Mount Charleston sometimes because they have those big patios that come out. Wood porches, decks, they'll get underneath those if they're not kept clean, and they'll den up underneath there. But that idea of the denning, keep in mind because we'll talk about it, it's important later. Underbrush, that's another big deal. All it takes is somewhere they can hide. That's another thing we'll talk about. Most active in the early mornings, evenings, and night, they can run to 25 or 30 miles an hour. Now, remember what I said about what we do when the temperature cools off? We become more active. They can be more active during the daylight when that weather starts cooling off because they're feeling a little freedom and a little oats and they want to get out and move around. But as a general rule, most of a coyote's activity happens between dusk and dawn. This is just to kind of give you an idea of the size difference. The bottom animal is a fox, the middle one's a coyote, and the top one, the big one, is a wolf. And the wolf, depending on the species, can be as long as 4.5, 5 feet long from nose to the back end. Coyote will never be that big. But that just kind of gives you a perspective. Coyotes can live in packs generally of 2 to 8 animals. There's 2 alphas, which means those are 2 animals that breed, 1 female and 1 male. Everything else is just there to be there. As soon as a coyote feels its oats and wants to take on the alpha male, he thinks he's big enough and bad enough to be breeding the female, then there's a battle and the loser leaves. A lot of times the loser is the young one, and so you might see a coyote wandering around like it's aimless, and it may be. It's probably looking for somewhere to hold up, somewhere, a territory that's unoccupied. So first and foremost, don't feed any wildlife directly or indirectly. Directly means exactly what it says. Don't go out and put food out for these animals. We have a school on the west side of town that calls constantly because somebody in the neighborhood came to school and said, "Oh my gosh, I saw a coyote out there in this big, huge, about 50, 60 acres of wide open space behind the school." And when we go out to explore to see just how bad this infestation of coyotes is, we find a 50-pound bag of dog food that somebody has taken out there and dumped in the desert. Now, I still don't think what they saw were coyotes because I didn't find all the other signs that go with it, feces, tracks, etc. Nonetheless, there is a growing sentiment with some people in the valley and probably, I'm guessing, across the country. If I throw food over my fence, if I take food out to the end of the street and feed them out there, then these animals won't come into the neighborhood. Well, that's like throwing diamonds outside of the store, the jewelry store, and hoping that nobody comes in the door to see what else is there. They're going to come see. That's an attractant. So whatever you do, don't feed them. Keep your garbage cans covered. Use a tight-fitting lid. All of us in the valley have to use the Republic Services cans, but make sure that the lid fits good and that it's down. If you have to stack it up, what we do at my house is I got one of those big landscaping blocks that goes right on top of the can to just keep the lid shut. Feed pets during daylight hours if you're feeding them outside, and please clean up after them. Anything you leave on the ground from your dog or your cat or whatever is just going to be an attractant for something else. And if it doesn't necessarily attract a coyote or a fox or something like that, it will attract the things that those animals eat. Bird feeders. I know that a lot of you feed birds, and some of you use the hummingbird feeders with the liquid gel in there and the sugar water in there. Some of you might be using seeds. Well, if a bird gets in and sticks its mouth in that seed collection, is it very clean and carefully pick up a seed at a time and eat it very daintily? Oh, heavens no. They get in there and they move their head around like this, and they got seeds going everywhere. And those seeds are all over the ground. Now, guess what comes to eat the seeds on the ground? Mice, rats, other small critters. The things that eat the small critters will come because the small critters are there to eat the seeds. So if you're feeding one animal, you're going to be feeding others, and so on. Contrary to what the movie says, Timon and Pumbaa would have been eaten by Simba. They wouldn't have gone up on the rock and sang songs, The Circle of Life. Does not work that way. And believe it or not, I have had people, they have a barbecue and they live next to the desert and all the bones go over the fence. And then they wonder. Now, we had a neighborhood on the east side of town, and this lady was bona fide frightened to death. She pulled up to get into her house, and 3 or 4 coyotes met her at the window of her car. And she was scared. We were there, we had a meeting, we were talking to people, and finally a guy in the back said, you know what, we have a guy that drives around every night and feeds them out of his car window. Well, there was the answer to the problem. The problem wasn't the coyotes. The problem was the guy that was driving around at night feeding coyotes out of the car window. And now they were habituated. We call that habituation to that's my source of food. Somebody pulls up in one of those things, I go there, and it hands it out. It's kind of like a machine with no requirement for money. And that's what they were doing. So those are just some things to keep in mind. But whatever you do, don't feed them. Avoid that temptation. Mother Nature provides everything that they need, and we want them to depend on that. That's where they belong. If we break that chain up, it creates problems, and it also creates safety issues. In the state of Nevada, certain species, they call them rabies vectors, cannot be kept, harbored, or fed on private property. Now, this is a hard statute for our guys to enforce, because if somebody, say your neighbor's out there feeding these animals, you have to be able to prove, that the law enforcement officer has to be able to prove that they're actually feeding a specific animal, not feeding something else, and that animal has to come. But that is in statute, and it's in the rabies statutes. It's in the rabies statutes because these animals get hanging out together, and the better chance that we're going to have a case of rabies, which we haven't had a confirmed case of rabies in Clark County for a long, long time, last time I checked. But nevertheless, those statutes go back, and Nevada actually has a whole series of rabies-related statutes to prevent the spread, because it can be devastating. But here's where we come on prevention. First and foremost, you got to let them know they aren't wanted. If you're not doing anything, if you're not honking your horn, if you're not spraying water at them, if you're not hollering at them, then we're part of the problem. We can't let them get comfortable. And you can't be shy. When I talk about hazing, I'm not talking about hazing like we see on TV with college campuses. I'm talking about letting these things know you're not there. So I had one person call and says, well, I'm not going to go out there and tell them to shoo. I said, that's not what I said. I said, I want you to go out there, and I want you to raise your voice, and I want you to make yourself look big, and I want you to holler like you're hollering at a ref you think made a bad call on your kid. Now tell me how many of you would be very gentle yelling at a ref that made a bad call? My daughter-in-law, you can hear her 3 doors down when the Cowboys are playing. So you can't be shy about it. You got to make yourself look as big as you can. And if you were out walking and you walk on a regular basis, carry a walking stick. That makes you look taller and bigger. And holler at them, hey, get out of here. I can't yell too loud. I'll run you guys out of here. But you know what I mean by now. Just like you're yelling at the opposing ref. You want him to yell at him. Carry a couple of tennis balls with you if you're walking and you're running into them, or if you see one in the front yard. Let them have it. It's okay. You don't want them to be comfortable. You want them to be edgy. Because the natural activity of a coyote, if he sees you, is if I'm in rural Nevada and I'm driving down the highway and I see a coyote and I stop the car, guess what that coyote does? Well, that coyote's out of there. He's not waiting for that car to come to a stop. He's moving. Because guess what they do in rural Nevada when the coyotes come into their chicken coop or to their cows? Yeah, they don't waste any time. And so those coyotes know that represents bad juju. I'm leaving. And here in town, what they'll do a lot of times when we start hazing them is they'll run off a little bit and then they'll turn, is that guy for real? And they're waiting to see how serious you are. So follow them up. Give them 5 more steps. Look real big. Holler at them. Yell at them. Carry one of those horns in a can like they use at the football games. Blast it. Things that make real noise. But you got to persevere. And when you see them the next day, do it again. It's not a one and done thing. It's going to take a little while, especially these ones that have been around us a long time. We just want them to know, hey, you're not welcome here. We don't want you to be comfortable. Don't let your small pets outside by themselves, especially in that hour, dusk to dawn. That's when they do most of their hunting. That's when they do most of their prowling around. That's why you see them driving in and out at night. I didn't say you wouldn't see them in the daytime. That's their primary activity time. And use a short leash. Don't get those real long expendable things. You're just holding it out there like bait. So keep it short. And if you see an animal, like whether it's a raptor, a fox, a coyote, pick it up if it's a small dog. Get it up off the ground so it's out of reach. Now, what they will do is they're kind of an interesting animal. They're very curious. And so they'll walk even parallel to you for a ways trying to figure out what you're about, what's that dog is about. Remember I talked about territoriality? Well, they're a canine, your dog's a canine. So your dog in many cases represents competition for available resources. And so keep that in mind when you're out there, that's partly it. So if you show them, hey, this animal's not a concern, I'm walking away, whatever you do, don't run. Because running triggers their natural chase instinct. They may not be doing anything but chasing because you're running, but it's enough to scare you. And I don't need to be doing any 100-yard dashes. My wife might think I should do at least a mile slowly, but the 100-yard dash isn't going to be good for me at this point in my life. So what we want to do, though, is pick them up and take that step. Clean up after your pet. There's some trails I hike, and the first quarter mile is nothing but a pet dump because people aren't cleaning up after their pet, and they're not doing it there, and they're not doing it in the yard. And if they're not cleaning that up, guess what that is? That's an attractant. That's the A word. That's an attractant. They will come because of your pet feces. And now keep bushes and other vegetation trimmed up. I'm always interested by the reports I get of somebody who's absolutely angry because they have pigeons, and you go and the neighbor is got like 10 pigeon feeders. There's nothing that anybody can do about pigeons, and we don't do those. Those are domestic wildlife, but there's nothing you can do about pigeons if the neighbor's feeding them that way. They're always going to be there. You can't change it. So it comes down to some teamwork with your neighbors on taking some of these steps. Let's talk about safety. Simply seeing a coyote is not cause for alarm. Like I say, they're not looking at you and seeing you like this big leg of lamb or something steaming and ready to eat. They're just out doing what coyotes do, and they're looking for that little morsel that they can find. We talked about what some of those are. So you don't need to call somebody just because you saw one. However, and I want to clarify what this is. A call may be warranted if a coyote is showing threatening behavior. If you haze a coyote and he runs off 20 yards or 30 yards and turns around to look at you, that's not a threat. He's turning around to see if you're for real. Do you really want me to leave? And he'll make adjustments and go where he wants. As long as they're making even a half-hearted attempt to move somewhere else, they're doing what a coyote's supposed to do. But if you are hazing one and it's standing and it's growling and it's baring its teeth and you're giving it room to leave, by the way, let me emphasize that. If you're hazing one, make sure they have an out because you want them to leave, so don't block them in. Make sure they have a way out. And if you're giving them all of that and they're still standing there and they're saying, hey, I'm going to eat you, aggressive, then they'll probably still be there when you call us and we send somebody out. But that's when we'll respond. But understand that if we respond, that animal will be euthanized. By law, it is illegal for us to move those rabies vectors. And because of that territoriality, it's not humane for us to move them from point A to point B because all we're doing is setting up a fight to the death. So they will be euthanized. Just understand that. Now let's talk about these statistics. I used to could get these bite statistics from Clark County Animal Control, and then they quit putting them on their website because I used them. But in between 2006 and 2010, there were 5,056 dog bites reported in Clark County. Now I emphasize reported because a lot of people won't report the dog bites because if a dog bites somebody, they have to be quarantined to make sure that they don't have rabies or something else. So some people won't go to that step of reporting the dog bite. So you got over 5,000 dog bites. During that same period of time, there were 2 reported, not confirmed, reported dog bites in Clark County. So tell me, where's your biggest fear? The Yorkie or the poodle down the street? Or the coyote? Those are actual numbers. I didn't make those up. Now, I'm not trying to poke fun at your fears. I'm not. I'm just trying to get a little sense of reality here because whatever our fears are real. Mine happens to be man-made heights. Just is. So those are something to keep in mind. And then these last 2. Let me back. Those 2 reported coyote bites involved 2 people that got between a coyote and their pet. And we don't know whether it was the dog, the pet dog that did the biting, because if you've ever picked up a dog that's been hit by a car, the first thing they do is lash out and bite you if it's still alive. Or if it was the coyote. We really have no way of knowing that. Now, since that 2010 and just the last 3 years, we've had 3 other instances that involve a human that was reported to have been bitten by a coyote. 2 of them were at the test site, and 1 of them was in East Las Vegas. In all 3 cases, the people were hand-feeding a coyote and seeing how close they could get to the coyote. So, you remember when you had kids and you told them, don't put your hand on the stove because it'll burn? And if you have multiple kids, I had 2. They had to test it to see if I was telling the truth. Well, I told you not to touch it. Yeah, but I didn't believe you, Dad. So, that's all I know compared to the dog bites. Now, so usually result of feeding activity. We don't want them to equate us as a food source. Remember the lady in the car being met because somebody in the neighborhood was feeding them out of the car, kind of like an ice cream truck? And it's more apt to occur when they've lost their natural fear of us. And that's where the hazing comes in. That's where putting the pressure on them, letting them know they're not welcome, and letting them come close to us. There was a symposium that was conducted on the east slope of the Rockies in Colorado, and they had everybody from Boulder down to Colorado or to Colorado Springs, and they had video that would show people just jogging by on these park trails with the coyote laying 3 feet off the trail because the coyote let them have their way and the runner let them have way and nobody was doing the hazing. So they implemented some hazing, and they started seeing the coyotes move off those trails, move back into the woods, move away from human activity.